The following program is a public access production. Comcast is required to provide time on this channel and make it available pursuant to franchise agreements with the communities we serve. Comcast is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of Comcast or its affiliates.
Yo, what's up? I'ma kick it with mine, y'all know. Yo, Slim, can I kick it like this? Here we go. Well, it's time to make that change. People of the world today are fading. All of us have our ups and downs. You better think about it or you won't be around. What we need is a little bit of love, sent by one from heaven up above. Chicken from tea is simple and plain. This ain't no game, you know what I'm saying? What? Yep, yeah.
Hello, I'm Tommy Meeks, and I would like to welcome you to a special edition of It's Time for a Change. This is February the 4th. You might see this show a little later, but this is the first chance that I have to talk about Black History Month from my point of view as an African American male. Now, I want to start the show off talking about an elderly lady I met of German descent. And she was, I can say she was a fan of mine. She watched my show. She got real upset when I wore one of my other dashikis to the show. And I could not understand. She felt that I was an American. I didn't have to wear anything with African wear. And then I asked her what was her ethnicity, and she said she was German. And I asked her, I said, did you feel the same way when Oktoberfest rolls around and German people put on their gear and they dance around with their beer and stuff? And it made her think. She's a wonderful woman. We had great conversations, but I felt that she was culturally somewhere else. So when Black History Month comes around, it's not just for African Americans. That's the reason I wanted to talk today from my point of view as an African American man and a proud American, that our history is really special. It's painful for some, but our long run goal to me should be great. And if we adhere to things that we as people know to be true, America will be the greatest country in the world for real if we start communicating with each other about the different ethnicities in this great country. I'm going to start with the early years of slavery. Now, the reason I want to start there is that African Americans came here in 1619 as slaves, and last year we recognized 400 years in this country as 246 years of those were enslaved people, and the rest of it was years of discrimination, and then we had civil rights. But I want to go back to the first part of the 246 years. Can you imagine how many generations come and go and die and are born again? Now, I want to talk to you specifically about something my grandfather told me. That's why I know I have my lineage there, because I wouldn't be sitting here if my ancestors hadn't suffered through a part of that 246 years. I asked my grandfather after graduating from college a couple years after, I said, Granddaddy, what do you know about our heritage in this country? I will leave some of the names out, but you'll get the gist of what I'm saying. He said that what he heard from his grandfather that there was a man named Captain Meeks who came down the road and wanted to purchase a slave. And he went to this Mr. Ferguson's plantation. He saw this big black slave who had made a bunch of Ferguson babies on that Mr. Ferguson's plantation. But this Captain Meeks wanted to purchase, didn't have a lot of money, wanted to purchase another slave. So he purchased Mr. Ferguson's oldest slave, who had made Ferguson babies all on that plantation. So Captain Meeks leaves with that Ferguson, and he takes him to his plantation. Now, all those Ferguson babies are still related to those Meeks babies once that man left, but nobody kept track of that. So I'm teaching school years later as a substitute teacher, and this girl came up to me and she said, "You look like blank Ferguson." I knew blank Ferguson. My brother Cedric looked more like blank Ferguson. If you try to understand it, you'll get the gist of it. I talked to Mr. Blank Ferguson years later, and he told me teachers used to get my brother Cedric and him mixed up all the time. Even girls used to get them mixed up all the time. But I couldn't help but think, my grandfather told me that years earlier, how Captain Meeks purchased a slave from Mr. Ferguson. That's how a lot of African Americans in this country, we've been all over this country, sold, bought, purchased in those 246 years, how it could come all the way forward. Now, were we really related to those Fergusons? I don't know. But that story my grandfather told me before he died still reigns in my heart, because that is my connection, that I can see what my ancestors went through in those 246 years. Now, when you talk about Black history, I want to bring you up to the Civil War. A lot of people think it was all over slavery. It wasn't. A big part of that was over the money. See, the North was paying their people to do the work. The South had free labor. I mean, common sense would tell you the South was banking in a lot of money. The North, our country, Washington, D.C., we knew we couldn't keep doing that. Eventually, we had a war. And that war freed the slaves, not in 1863 like the Emancipation Proclamation says, but after the war was over. That's when a lot of those slaves really found out about their freedom. And I'll tell you why, because I also promote an event called Juneteenth. When I found out about that, it was something that my grandfather celebrated in our family in Arkansas, that none of his children would work on June 19th. So to me, Juneteenth started on June 19th, 1865. And that was when African Americans at least planned to move forward in our newfound freedom. But it wasn't that easy. What do a people do when they've worked for 246 years and they've received $0 for that work? Zero land for that work. 40 acres and a mule was something that the Congress had only talked about. They never ratified it. They might have voted on it, but it never was confirmed. Shortly after that war, they actually blow the head of Abraham Lincoln off. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, he kind of ties in what we're dealing with today, because Andrew Johnson was the first president in our country that was impeached. And I'll be honest, I didn't know a lot about that. But with the impeachment talk of today, that we impeached President Clinton, and it was not bipartisan, and we impeached our current president, President Trump. But talking about this history, I want to go back to Andrew Johnson. I want people to know why he was impeached. And if we fast forward to today, we'll have a chance to see how partisan we are as a country. And if we don't get our act together, you know, they say about the people that don't know their history, you're doomed to repeat it. Andrew Johnson was President Abraham Lincoln's vice president. He's from Tennessee. He had slaves, but he did not want to secede with the rest of the South. He stuck around in D.C. So Abraham Lincoln said, this guy might be a good vice president for me. Far from the truth, but still, when Abraham Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson became the president. Now, our country had felt bad. I didn't go into depth about what happened in those 246 years or the Middle Passage to even come to this country. Most of you that know history, you should know that. But I wanted to focus on Andrew Johnson because of what's happening today if we go back and look. Andrew Johnson became the president. The first thing he started doing was cutting some of Abraham Lincoln's programs and the Republicans of the day, who were the lenient ones toward the slave movement. He started cutting programs that was geared for the reconstruction of the African American people in this country. And the Republican Congress at the time says, hey, we implemented that. You can't go cutting those programs. We're trying to help the former enslaved people with the reconstruction. Well, as the president of the United States, he felt, I don't know if they called it executive order back then, but he felt he had a right to cut all those reconstruction programs that were geared to help those slaves that had been enslaved for 246 years. So the Congress went to battle. They impeached him for cutting programs that was geared to help the Reconstruction period. We fast forward what happened in the Congress, just like what's happening to our Senate today. The Senate survived and gave him an acquittal by one vote. I'm sure it was his two Democrat constituents in Tennessee. One of them voted to keep him in, that tied it, and another one voted to acquit him. I don't think the votes are going to be like that when it comes to President Trump. He's not going anywhere. President Clinton wasn't going anywhere. But if you take a look at all three of those, you have to look at our country. The partisan bickering, the two sides, is not going to be good for us if we don't learn to come together as a people. So let's fast forward to the Reconstruction. Ulysses S. Grant became the president. They put in a lot of things that helped the former enslaved people become American citizens. The men could vote. Well, no women could vote back then. Even the African American men could vote during the Reconstruction period. We had so much good things going our way. We had African Americans in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress, and we were floating along real good. And you got to know, if we had done all the work for 246 years, can you imagine what we did in a 10-year span? Yes, we were doing very well in 10 years. We had mayors of cities. I'm talking about African Americans. We had mayors of cities. We even had a governor, an African American governor, an interim basis, but he still was a governor in Louisiana during the Reconstruction. Now, I say all this because a lot of people don't know that the Reconstruction period was the time that we could have really straightened things out in America. But I think it was Rutherford B. Hayes worked out a backroom deal to get all the protections for the former slaves during the 10-year span, 1865 to 1875, to get rid of all of our protections. And at the end of 1865, they pulled all the troops out of the South. And anybody knows anything about history, the KKK came in after that. The Jim Crow laws came in after that. And the rest is history. I'll give you just a few examples of what happened after that period. In the South, they start creating laws that we could lock up a person that doesn't have a job. Now just imagine this scenario. You're a young black man working for Mr. Charlie. And then Mr. Charlie decides to fire you because he don't want to pay you. So Mr. Charlie fires you, and you walking down the street in the South, and the sheriff rides by and he says, "Boy, how come you ain't working?" And he says, "Well, sir, Mr. Charlie fired me yesterday and I don't have a job." "Well, young man, you are under arrest," because they had laws in the South that if you didn't have a job, you could be arrested. So they arrested him. They gave him a big fine, said you got to work your fine off. And then sometimes they would send him right back to Mr. Charlie's plantation or his farm. And he started working, in a sense, for free. If you don't believe me, look up a book called Slavery by Another Name, written by a white man named Douglas Blackman. It's right there. It's sad to see the things that we done back in that day, but that still wasn't enough. Let's fast forward. Jim Crow, that era was really tough on people in the South. It wasn't super great in the North either for African American people. We always stayed on the outside of what it took to make America go. Just imagine people coming to our country from Europe, Irish, Italians, Germans, it didn't matter. When they got here, our government had plans to set up where they could just go and stake out land in the Midwest and in the Far West. They gave them that land for free, but they had to be white to get that. All those 246 years our people were here, working as slaves, never earning a nickel. And after slavery, they promised us 40 acres and a mule. They never implemented or ratified it. We never received free land. This free land for immigrants from Europe went on for a very long time, not just in the 1800s, even in the 1900s, they were still giving away free land for immigrants. Now, when you have land, you have wealth. All those free slaves, we never received anything like that. We had to still work. So we've always been behind. We've always been behind. We fast forward to the 1920s, and I said this on one of my last programs. I was talking about Woodrow Wilson, and people talk about Trump so racist. Well, I can't tell you how racist Trump is because I don't know him. I've seen him do some things that I don't agree with, but is he like down to the bone racist? I can't say that. But I know Woodrow Wilson, who we claim was a great president here. He welcomed the Ku Klux Klan into the White House. I think if President Trump did that, at least if they were wearing sheets, we'd have a problem with that today. But there's a lot of people say that the Klan don't wear sheets no more, they wear suits. Well, I wear a suit. There's a lot of people that wear suits. I've always been the type of person, I deal with people in the way they treat me, and I'll continue to do that. I'm not gonna go around saying who's a racist and who's not a racist. But there were so many things that African Americans were not a part of in the 1900s, 1920, 1910. Our government was rolling. I never heard of the Tuskegee Airmen until the 1990s. And I graduated high school in 1973. Was I not paying attention? Did we just refuse to even talk about the contributions that African Americans played? I know I jumped from the Reconstruction period to the 1930s and 40s, but we as a people were not looked at as American citizens. And in the South, it was even worse. Let's fast forward a little bit more, because the Jim Crow era in the South, it was really harsh on our people. But there was a preacher that a lot of people still never heard of. His name was Reverend Vernon Johns. And he was a rabble rouser. He was not scared of anybody in Alabama. From what I hear, if you ever see the movie Vernon Johns, from what I understand, they really thought he was insane. But he was the first preacher that headed the church that Martin Luther King came from. So those people in that church, they got upset with Vernon Johns talking about what should African Americans do. What he was trying to do was to wake our people up and say, look, if they won't give us the help we need to help ourselves. You can't imagine the black people even back then that was so against him for even thinking about talking about African Americans creating their own wealth, creating their own stores and own food in the 1950s. So they ran him out of that church in Alabama. And they said, we got to get a preacher that's not going to start stuff in our community. Well, who was that preacher? It was Dr. Martin Luther King. They had no idea what they were headed for. I know I left out a lot of our history in the late 1900s, like Plessy versus Ferguson. But what I really want to get to is that history is there. I want you, if you really believe that our country is as great as I think it is, start studying your history. Our YouTube channel on our phones, on our TVs, is a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of truth. This is history that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand. We went through a lot of things in this country. And I will say Martin Luther King did not start it all. But when you look at people like Medgar Evers, who took it upon himself in Mississippi to make sure that African Americans could vote and be a part of a system when we had huge numbers. They came up with poll taxes. They came up with ideas to keep us out of the ballot box. They had jars of jelly beans. Say, you got to tell us the number of jelly beans in that jar, boy, before you even try to vote. Who's going to do that? And the young brother or the old brother just walk away. When Dr. King started talking about civil rights, he really meant for us to be able to walk this land as Americans and have all the rights as Americans. But at the same time, when Dr. King was coming out in the mid-50s, our country was doing something else that would keep us behind by law. There were a group of men, I think it was a family, called the Levitts. What happened, a lot of the African Americans from the South, including my father and my mother, my uncles, my aunts, they started coming up from Arkansas. My father came up from Mississippi. What happened was the projects, we had a lot of poor whites, we had a lot of poor blacks. Our government said, build projects over here for all whites. Build projects over here for all blacks. They constantly wanted to keep us separate. And all that history I talked about prior, every white person wasn't against us. We had abolitionists back then that they literally died to help us to keep moving forward. There were white people that were intermarrying with black people, even against the law. So even in the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, we had a lot of white support, but people were still afraid because I think our own government still was not behind us. With Levittown, what they came to the government to do, they said, we can close down the white projects and move more blacks in there, and then we'll build suburbs around these big cities, and we'll pass laws, and they did, you can look it up. Nobody black could ever live in those suburbs, and we've seen problems like that. And nobody white that lives in Levittown can ever sell to anybody black. If they're black, you can't sell. These are laws that we had in our books, in our banking laws, let alone the redlining. Now I'm going to come up to Dr. King because I'm going to tell you right now, most people that I talk to, and I talk to a lot, the first question I ask them, how many speeches do you know by Dr. King? Most people, I have a dream. Don't listen to it. It's a great speech. It's a great dream. But go to YouTube, pull up every Dr. King speech you can pull up and start listening to that. Because he was saying some things after the Civil Rights Movement, after the Voting Rights Act. He was saying, maybe I made a mistake by just asking for civil rights. We needed economic rights. Now that fast forwards us to the day. African Americans still in 2020, in a place like Rockford, and I'm sure cities all over the country, we are not economically sound as far as what it takes to create jobs for people, to put people in business, to get loans, to take that risk, to start that business. We are still behind times there. When you talk about African American history, we have to encompass it all in there because this is a great country. When you listen to Dr. King's speeches and just not the I Have a Dream, where do we go from here? A new phase of civil rights, the other America. I mean, there's so many. Listen to them, fast forward to the day and say, look, we haven't always been fair, but this country has so much potential to be great. I believe it, and I know a lot of you believe it. If we don't start communicating with each other about truth, about real history and real problem solving, if we take that effort to listen to what Dr. King really said and bring it forward to 2020, as a collective group of Americans, we can really start making a difference in this country. Now, my good friend Kenny Burns told me I got 2 minutes left. I got to say something about us as African American people as we hold up our hands and say, it's Black History Month, it's Black History Month. Our ancestors suffered for 246 years as slaves. It is almost unbelievable the way some of our young people, and including me, did not take advantage of a great education. In this country, if you educate yourself nowadays, nobody can stop you. We have work to do, not just as African Americans, but as all Americans. It's a big world out there. If we get ourselves together as Americans and get rid of some of this hate that is still hanging around, lingering around for hundreds of years, let haters stay over there if that's where they want to be. But like Dr. King says, God is love. If we bring all the love out that's in us and start treating people the way we want to be treated, you'd be surprised of the things that God has given us as human beings in America, that we can make a difference in this country, and then we could start going abroad to help anybody that's willing to receive our help. But it's hard for us to help other people if we don't help ourselves. I'm going to finish by saying there's 2 men I want you guys to start watching on YouTube. JFK and Dr. Martin Luther King, 2 of the greatest Americans that ever lived. They are speaking the truth in the 1960s that are so relevant today, your head will spin if you listen. I believe in this country. I believe in Rockford. I believe in Winnebago County. I believe in the state of Illinois that we can be better people if we start working together and acknowledging our past and dreaming of a better future. I did all this in 30 minutes. It's hard to believe. But I want to say this to you and then I'm done. God has been good to us. Let's be good to ourselves based on the goodness that he has given us. It's right there for us to see. It's right there for us to see. Communicating with each other is the way we will fix our problems. And as usual, like I always say, I'll see you next time.
Well, it's time to make that change. People of the world today are fading. All of us have our ups and downs. You better think about it or you won't be around. What we need is a little bit of love, sent by one from heaven up above. Chicken from tea is simple and plain. This ain't no game, you know what I'm saying? What? Yep, yeah. Here we go. Oh, yeah. Yo, Mob, kick it for me one time.